Hi, everybody. I'm Marilyn, founder and CEO of Cosmic Centaurs, and your host for most of this third edition of the annual Cosmic Conference, all about the employee experience. We have this conference split over 3 tracks. We're looking at the employee experience as a strategic decision and how it links to your business goals. We're looking at the employee experience touch points, as well as the human factor in employee experience. So stay tuned. If you want to look at our lineup, the team will put the link to our conference website in the comments. We will be having 1 or 2 lives every day from today until October 21st, as well as publishing some content for your asynchronous consumption. So do join us either for a live session or simply to read up on everything we've been doing. Before we start today, as always, show us some love, give this video a like, share your comments, your thoughts, your feedbacks, your lessons learned in the comments. Laurel and I would love to see all of those questions and hopefully answer some of them before the session ends. And let me start by introducing our guest, Laurel Farrer. Actually, Laurel is the founder of Distribute, a virtual organizational development think tank and consulting firm. She is an internationally renowned thought leader on the topic of remote work. For the past 15 years, she's been unlocking the power of distributed workforces to create impact in corporate and socioeconomic infrastructures. She and her team of fellow experts collaborate with the world's leading businesses and governments on 3 primary topics: how to convert business operations from physical to virtual, how to build products and content for the remote work market, and how to leverage workplace flexibility to solve global concerns. In addition to being a regular Forbes contributor, Laurel's subject matter expertise has also been showcased by brands like Zoom, Microsoft, Gallup, NPR, Logitech, BBC, New York Times, Vistaprint, Fast Company, and Upwork. She was also included on Forbes' Next 1,000 list of inspiring entrepreneurs in 2021 and has been an inspiration to us here at Cosmic Centaurs from the first day we started the company. Laurel, it's such an honor to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
I'm very excited about everything we're going to learn. Today, Laurel's going to start with a presentation all about workplace flexibility and, helping us understand why work is something you do, not a place you go. In fact, that's an interesting anecdote about the word office, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But for our audience, if you think back about to hold office meant to have a role in its original English sense. Only later did it develop into a place. And so in many ways, we're going back to that understanding of work as something you do, not somewhere you go. And in fact, research shows most recently that this is from Nick Bloom's research, 91% of employees find remote and flexible work hours to contribute to their happiness and well-being, and they value it around the same amount as an 8% pay increase. So we are here today to talk about what true flexibility means and how you can implement it in your organization. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Laurel, and I'll be back in a few minutes to have a follow-up discussion about everything we're going to learn together. Laurel, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marilyn. When we're talking about employee experience, I have a slightly different perspective because I don't know how many of you know me directly or know my work, but something that most people, even my close friends and fellow thought leaders, don't know about me is that I started my career as an interior designer. This was way back when, right? Eons ago. But I was definitely participating in the interior design of corporate spaces. And so I have a very firm idea of what workplaces should and shouldn't be. And so it's so funny to think about how we fast forward to our time together today and think about a completely different definition of workplace. However, I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from this and from that history of what do we know about workplaces? What have we learned about workplaces since the Industrial Revolution when we started sharing workplaces? And how can we take those lessons and apply them into the virtual world and then start to build on them? So that's a little bit about what of who we are here at Distribute. There was a bit of a delay in my presentation, but I want to give the disclaimer that I have had COVID this week, ironically, so my voice isn't what it usually is. Tyler knows me. Tyler's here. Hi, Tyler. Anyway, I so my voice is not what it usually is. So you're going to see my by tea and tissues, but I hope that we're keeping it real here. Anyway, but that's who I am this week, but who my company is, Distribute. We are a consulting firm specializing exclusively in remote work, as Marilyn so eloquently introduced. And we do specialize in a lot of different things relating to remote work. However, as you can imagine, what we've done a lot of for the past 2 years is that change management side. So we do help companies convert their operations to be from physical to virtual. And we do that through a lot of different ways. We do that through a lot of data analysis and investigation into their operational model, and as well as just a facilitation of a traditional change management process. We'll talk a little bit about what those resources and analysis methods are later on, but where we need to start this conversation is exactly where we started in the introduction, which is that work is something that we do, not somewhere that we go, right? And until we really not only understand that and comprehend that, but we really accept that and start to leverage that, we're never really going to understand what it means to operate in a virtual first manner. Because this is a fight that we've been having as advocates for a long time, is that people think that remote work as a trend is just about where people are working. And it is not. It's about so much more than that. In fact, this is where you start to get introduced to our methodology here at Distribute a little bit, is this is a, excuse me, a description and an outline of the change management lifecycle, or the remote work adoption lifecycle of companies. So you can see here on the bottom left corner, we've got people that are just exploring what it might mean to be a flexible company. Then they start to construct different resources, construct the office, right, of your workers, just like you would if you were working in a physical space. You need a place for people to work. So you're going to build the building. Then you're going to adopt what the ways of working are for people to work in the same place at the same time, right? What time are we going to show up? What time are we going to leave? Do you need a key card to get in the door, right? There's all of those little logistics to start moving into this building, shall we say? And then we start optimizing this office space. So once we understand what it means to go into an office and work in the office in the same way, then we can really start to use that to our advantage and start to invite other people there and start to have cultural experiences there. So when people are coming to us as remote work consultants, we ask them a lot of questions, as you can imagine, and we have an intake form and an intake process in which we analyze where they are in the change management process. So when we are asking them these questions, on average, they perceive that they are somewhere between 3 and 4 in this adoption life cycle. So they say, yeah, we've moved into the office. We're doing great. We've been working this way for 2 years. We're just, need to tighten some things up a little bit and move across the finish line. However, that's not necessarily what is true or accurate. So we take them through what is called a virtual health analysis, and we analyze 6 different categories of the change process. And I do see that we have some choppy video and audio, which is really unfortunate. I'm closing everything out on my side that I have. It's smooth on my side. Marilyn, if you have any suggestions, jump on in. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep going, and maybe we can record this for asynchronous distribution later.
Yeah, absolutely what I was thinking too. So go ahead, just keep going. Hopefully, Ustream will catch up, and if not, it's going to be available for rewatch later.
Fantastic. All right. So thank you everyone for your patience. Hopefully you're catching a little bit of what I'm saying, but yes, we'll record this asynchronously. Okay. So next, moving on. So these are the 6 categories that we measure. And so we're measuring the change management process from beginning to end. However, excuse me. However, it does reveal some different results than what our clients perceive. So they perceive that they're almost done. We've been working this way. We've been doing great. Now let's move on and let's go across the finish line. However, what is revealed is that their actual status is somewhere between 1 and 2. And as you can imagine, this definitely brings up some thoughts and some feelings of, What? What? We've been working this way for 2 years. How is it even possible that we are not close to the finish line? Well, that's what we're talking about today, is that if we are only thinking about remote work as a workplace change, if it just means that we're moving people from one place to another, we are not operating as a distributed organization. We are allowing people to work from home, but we are not operating as a sustainable and successful distributed organization. So, what is the difference between just allowing people to work from home and being a successful, sustainable distributed organization? Well, the whole concept there is that we're going to stop talking about where people are working. And we're going to start talking about how people are working, because that is what workplace flexibility has always been about. You can see here that I have a book right here from the 1970s. This is essentially the invention of remote work. And in it, it talks about not necessarily the tools and the technical enablement of workplace flexibility, but what are we going to need to do as people, as managers, as organizations, in terms of organizational behavior in order to enable this to happen. Now, we've come a long way since the 1970s, and so that's what I'm going to very briefly share with you today are 4 ways that you can really finish constructing this office, not just tell people to move out of an office, but create and build a whole new space for them and design the logistics and behaviors and align those logistics and behaviors in a way that will start to create more cohesion and connection in your team, as well as increase efficiency. So let's jump right into it. Knowing that a lot of you can't hear me, I apologize for that. But hopefully you can watch this video later if it's something that you want to dive into. So the objectives that we're talking about here, just with probably the next 10 minutes or so, is that we're looking at 4 primary objectives. And what these can be categorized as are the 4 ways that virtual offices or virtual workplaces need to be different than physical workplaces. And as we convert them, in these 4 categories, as we convert our organizational behavior, then we can become a more successful and sustainable distributed organization. So let's look at these individually. But to introduce them, they are asynchronous communication, performance measurement, cultural alignment, and knowledge management. So let's look at what each of those are individually. Excuse me. So first, synchronous and asynchronous collaboration. Now, a lot of us have had these conversations, so this is familiar territory for a lot of us that are deep into the remote work world. However, this is what most people need to understand, that this is why Zoom fatigue happens. So even though a lot of companies are saying, oh yeah, we're doing great, we're fully distributed, they are still working under the concept that teamwork only happens when we are sharing time and location, because that's been conditioned into us for so long. So when we can't share a conference room to have a conversation, then that means we need to move to the next best thing, which is a Zoom room, right? And most of us know that that is wrong, but the rest of the world is still struggling with that as a concept. It's very new, it's very novel, it's very original to them. So we need to help them understand that teamwork still happens even though you may not be sharing time and location. So if you're having a Slack conversation or a Microsoft Teams conversation, that is still a conversation. You are still working together as a team towards a shared goal. Same time. Another lag. Thank you all for your patience with this platform. The next is measurement of presence versus productivity. Ooh, this is a controversial one, right? All of us as advocates and enthusiasts of remote work have at least once been asked the question, well, how will I know if somebody's working if I can't see them? And that's where we have to give the classic rebuttal of, well, how did you know that they were working when you could see them, right? This has been a problem for a long time that we just have needed to address and solve, regardless of workplace location. People were looking really busy, or they were in a certain place, but does that mean that they were actually productive? Does that mean that they were fulfilling the highest measure of their performance? Maybe not. Maybe not. So we need to be going back to the root word of productivity, which is produce, and we need to be measuring results, or more formally known in the business world as objectives and key results and key performance indicators. The more that we track, monitor, and measure those, the more success we'll have. Something is similar about culture, right? This is such a valid argument. I shouldn't say, well, it is valid, but it's also a common argument of so many leaders of we need to get back into the office in order to measure productivity and build culture, right? However, we all know and we all remember that no matter what we may remember about the office, we all have experienced at least one time in which we were sitting right next to somebody else and we felt completely invisible. We felt completely isolated. It was, we didn't feel connected to anyone, even though we were in very close proximity. So we have to remember that proximity is absolutely not the same as connection. What that connection does come from is when whoever was sitting next to you turns to you and says, hey, you look overwhelmed. You looked confused. How can I help you? Right? Well, that's what we need to be facilitating is conversations, information. That's what creates that connection. And speaking of information, something that is little known about the isolation that people feel when they are working remotely is that it's usually not social isolation. Now, it feels like it's been social isolation for the past few years because, news alert, we've all been socially isolated, right? We've been sheltering in place. We've been quarantining. We've all been socially isolated. That's not because we were working remotely. That's because there was a global pandemic. So the social isolation that you may or may not be feeling right now is probably not related to remote work. What remote workers typically feel is what's called informational isolation. And what that is when people are at work, other people, their coworkers, are a resource. So when we feel disconnected from our coworkers, we feel disconnected from our ability to do our job well, because we can ask them questions and get confirmation and validation and quality assurance from our coworkers. So what we need to be doing is facilitating those connections and facilitating the sharing of information that will create that sense of connection, that sense of alignment, and prevent that feeling of isolation, much more than creating social experiences. So these are our 4 objectives: asynchronous communication, performance measurement, cultural alignment, knowledge management. Now, I'm going to move on to the next section very quickly. I'm going to breeze over it. Now, if you can hear me, be paying attention to the chat on the side. I know a lot of you are experiencing sound issues. Marilyn did want everybody to know this is being recorded, and so you can watch this asynchronously later. I apologize again for the issues, but appreciate your patience and flexibility. See what I did there? Flexibility. So let's talk about our action list here. What do we need to do as teams in order to adopt these 4 objectives or these 4 principles and convert our organizational behavior in order to be more successful as a distributed team? Well, in order to do that asynchronous communication, we need to conduct a meeting audit, right? We need to be the person that bravely raises their hand and says, could this meeting be an email? That's how it gets started, right? We just need to be able to start converting over from synchronous to asynchronous. On the performance measurement side, we need to be setting objectives and key results and key performance indicators and recording them in some type of project management system. Now, this might be a great tool like Asana or ActiveTrack or Monday.com. Those are great options. However, it doesn't have to be a tool. It can just be a ritual. Meet together on Monday mornings and say, what are you working on this week? Do you need help? What are your deadlines? And that's it. You just understand what each other is working on, what your workloads are, so you can measure what people are producing. Next is that cultural alignment. So please, instead of focusing on planning yet another virtual happy hour, let's instead focus on what people are doing, how they are connecting with each other, what they're conversing about in order to build that sense of connection. And a really good place to start is, if you're a hybrid team, do an audit of your return to office messaging. Spoiler alert, there is, if the phrase return to work exists anywhere in your messaging, you've got a problem. Because what that is communicating to people is that if you are working remotely, you're not working. You're only working if you're in a co-located environment. And automatically that's going to create a discrimination in your employee experience between virtual workers and on-site workers. And last but not least is that knowledge management system. How do we share information more effectively and asynchronously? You build a handbook. So GitLab's handbook is, the piece de resistance that most people refer to. It does not need to be 20,000 pages. It can be something much, much smaller. It can just start as an FAQ document that people have access to, but somewhere share information about how things work in your company, what cultural expectations are, what performance expectations are, and start sharing information that is accessible regardless of time and location. The more that we do this, the more that it automatically enables location independence. And so you don't have to be thinking so proactively, so intentionally about how do we enable remote work in our organization. It becomes a natural and organic byproduct. It becomes a consequence the more that you think about work as something that you do instead of somewhere that you go. With all of this, it is very important to remember that adoption life cycle that I showed you earlier. The future of work is not done. We are not done. We are not finished with our change management process, not even by a long shot. However, don't let that discourage you. Don't let that overwhelm you. Yes, there is hard work still ahead of all of us, all of our organizations, regardless if we've been doing this for 5 months or 5 years or 5 decades. There's still work ahead of us in order to optimize as virtual organizations. But the whole future of work has never been about what's easy or what's convenient. It's about how do we change the business world for the better? How do we change this in a way that's going to make our entire conversations and ways of doing business more human oriented? So let that be a motivator for you. If you have any questions about the content that you've heard today, please feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm the only Laurel Farrer on LinkedIn, so it's easy to find me. But if you're brave enough to ask in front of the group, you're welcome to do so in the Q&A right now. I'm sure there probably are a lot of questions if you weren't able to hear me the majority of the time.
No, hopefully, I mean, we'll certainly be able to restream this. It's quite strange because I've been able to hear you the whole time, so I have lots of for you. So worry not. Hopefully, I will be representing the questions of the crowd, even if they weren't available to watch live. But also, everybody, you can leave your comments later when we restream this, and maybe Laurel can come and answer in the comments as well. I have quite a few questions for you, actually. Thank you so much for that presentation. I really, when I listen to you at Running Remote in Montreal, and I know you have a lot of really great stories and examples from the many companies that you've supported along the way. So I'd love to hear, a few of those as we go. I think I'll try to kind of go in the same order as you presented things. But, of course, one of the points that you bring up is really that transformational moment. It's a process. It takes time. It's really about rethinking all of the various aspects of how we work in a holistic way. As you said, it's not as simple as saying, great, we don't have an office anymore. Proceed. We are now fully remote. Wonderful. So of course, in an ideal world, as an organization, you have the leadership and the ability to kind of say, all right, we're going to do this big picture rethinking. What does it mean to switch to remote first, and how will we get there? But what are some like baby steps? You've shared a few, I know already, that meeting audit, how you measure performance. I'm going to deep dive into some of those and ask you a few more questions. But tell us a story about how you've seen companies start with baby steps when it comes to those things.
Yeah, that was one of the most fascinating things about the pandemic in general, is that we were used to working with organizations that already had this in their mind, right? You're not going to call a remote work consultant until you're ready to talk about remote work. However, with the pandemic, it opened that market up so much more. And so we all of a sudden were working with clients that were barely using email, that they had only paper file systems, that they hadn't digitized any like point of sale systems or anything. Like, it was absolutely shocking. So if I were to say, in the most micro ways possible, regardless of where you are in your comfort level with full distribution, I would say that the primary habits to start working on are, number one, asynchronous communication. Just get in the habit of using tools like Slack or Microsoft Teams as your primary source of gathering your team. So that is going to do a lot of things. That's going to become your virtual office. That's going to become a primary source of documentation. That's going to kill a lot of birds with one stone, so to speak. So number one, just start there. Start using some tool like that and gathering everybody together and making sure everybody's using that at the same level. Number one, that's where I would start. Number two, if you're already there, really focus on your habit and your culture of documentation. So we talked about that virtual handbook. Lean into that a little bit more and think about how your virtual office space and Slack or Teams is playing with that handbook and building habits of your team to go use that handbook and contribute to it on a daily basis.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions around knowledge creation and documentation because I think that's such an important asset to organizations. But before we get to that, you spoke about that meeting audit. We actually did for one of our clients. We worked with them on like listing. They were a team of 50 people in a larger organization. We worked with them on listing every meeting they have or attend, who is there, how many hours they spend, and then turned it into a dollar value, and everybody just fell off their chair, right?
Yeah.
How do you go about replacing meetings with other things, with documentation, with emails, with polls if there's a decision to be made? What's your approach to kind of nudging organizations? I always say the ideal scenario is you cancel all of them and then you see what creeps back, but nobody wants to be this extreme.
Yeah, exactly. And especially not after such a controversial time of change management for the past 2 years. There's a lot of people that are very resistant to this change. And so we want to make sure that we're making the process as easy as possible to increase our adoption rates. So typically what we do is we have what we call our synchronous asynchronous model, which is essentially a linear graph of activities and types of conversations that can be asynchronous versus synchronous. And we talk about the value of each, and we talk about the employee experience of each. And so we talk about really opening the minds to the leaders of, this is not an either or. It's not synchronous or asynchronous. There's a lot of different dynamics that can happen within this realm. When are the right times to use which types of conversation? And there's about 5 different categories in that model. And so we do that when we are conducting a meeting audit. We're breaking each bullet point into those 5 categories. And those are based on different X factors, like, is the information that's being shared, is it unidirectional or bidirectional? Meaning, are multiple people contributing, or just 2 people contributing, or 1 person? If it's 1 person, that can be a video or that can be an email. If it's 2 people, that can be a one-to-one. But if it's a group conversation, yes, that is where you should be having a synchronous conversation. So we help them think about it in terms and X factors like that, and start dividing different types of conversations into the different categories, which then help them filter it into different channels.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know that, those who sit on the very extreme side of the spectrum of remote work, they will say like zero synchronous time together. But I know that you have a more nuanced perspective on this. Can you share a little bit with us about like, when do you think it's worth it? You shared like a group discussion is worth it. Are there other instances where, yeah, let's be synchronous?
Yeah, anytime that a conversation is very sensitive or emotional, that you need the benefit of as much body language and nonverbal communication to be in that conversation as possible. So um, either a synchronous conversation or an in-person conversation is great for that. The other things are if it is very creative and innovative, it's nice to have that be synchronous because you can bounce off of each other's spontaneity and creativity. Anytime that it is, like I said, unidirectional, that it is that there's not feedback or input that is required from your output, that's when you should de-escalate it to a more asynchronous channel. So, and that's going to be very, very different on your culture. So yeah, this conversation of like synchronous versus asynchronous, I think is completely unrealistic and ridiculous and very insensitive to a lot of companies. We have to start thinking about how do we leverage this in a way that suits our culture best. So for some cultures, they're going to remain very synchronous heavy, and that's good for them. Others are going to be very, very async heavy, and that's good for them. So we have to stop making it this competition and start seeing it as a tool and a strategy that can be leveraged in different ways and for different environments.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think sometimes when the conversation's a bit too binary, we all lose out, right? It's not one against the other. It's a spectrum, and we can find, different solutions across the board. And definitely in some cultures, for example, Anglo-Saxon cultures are very different, for example, from where I live, where, trust and interpersonal relationships sometimes even supersede someone's skill or ability to do something. We will hire someone because we trust them. They may not have been the best candidate, and so that face-to-face time and that synchronicity becomes a very important culturally. So I think that's it's quite sensitive
Yeah.
to look at that culture piece when you're thinking about these things. And as you're saying, like some of it is about replacing it with documentation. We're, human beings are really bad archivers, generally speaking. Like some of us are good at it, but it takes a lot of discipline. What are some of your advice about starting to build a documentation culture?
So start with the smallest points of impact, right? Where starting with your rituals in which you can all support each other in that process. So at the end of every meeting, make it a bullet point that you cannot conclude the meeting until you all contribute to the documentation of the meeting. So you have space in every single agenda doc that says, what are our action items? Who's responsible for what? What happened in this meeting? What does somebody need to know if if they didn't participate in the meeting? So that when you're together and you're synchronous, you can leverage that accountability in order to build the habit. And then you can build into, excuse me, other rituals as well. Things like your, weekly stand-up or your reporting for your performance measurement every Friday, and just saying, okay, this is what we need from you. And so you're building the habit. You're using very explicit communication in order to say, this is what documentation is. This is what I need from you. And then over time, the workers will generate more of a strength to be able to think proactively about, oh, this is what I usually do, and so this is what I should do this time. They'll be able to associate and come to their own conclusions. But in the meantime, there needs to be very high accountability and very explicit instructions about what does this culture of documentation look like? How do you participate in it? And then allow them to build the habit themselves.
And do you think, making that part of the culture is something that middle management should be championing? Is it actually better to have champions that are already enthusiastic about this, that go around kind of helping people to transition, upskilling them, training them, or just simply being a cheerleader for this process?
So ideally, every single person needs to be involved. Cannot fall onto one level of responsibility. So, and that's the problem that actually a lot of remote work change management or barrier to success is that the leaders look at the workers and say, this is your responsibility. And the workers look at the leaders and say, we're waiting. And it's a big problem. So every single person needs to be involved in this change. Now, obviously, too many cooks in the kitchen, right? So there are a lot of organizations that are higher up in the remote work world that have been doing this for longer, and they have established that it is ideal to have either one person that is accountable for the virtual handbook, or a team of people, one person from each department that all contributes to the handbook. And they might delegate tasks and ask, certain people to write certain sections, but ultimately they are responsible and accountable for the creation of that material and the maintenance of it, because it is such a big job. So yeah, we do recommend that as a strategy, because it is a massive undertaking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember in the conversation during the conference in Montreal, one of the questions about whether a head of remote is needed or not, some of the answers, at least my perspective, and I'd love your comment on that, is that head of remote is like, for me, it's like the chief digital officer of 10 years ago. You need them for a little bit, because you need someone who you can give budget to, someone who has accountability and responsibility to kind of transition the organization into that way of working. But hopefully on the long run, they make their own job obsolete. What's your view on that?
It depends on the organization. So we actually have a whole white paper that's specifically about this. So you can go search it on Google. It's just it's hosted on remote.com, who was our partner for the white paper for the publication. And the title is, Do You Need a Head of Remote? And this is the conversation that we have. What most people need to understand about the heads of remote that they see in the media is that is their job, is to market how remote work happens at this organization. So they're not necessarily responsible for change management or even optimization and implementation. They're responsible for marketing. So if they're looking at those jobs and they say, oh, that's cool, I want to do that, like that may be a really bad fit for their company based on where they are in the change management lifecycle. So what needs to happen is an evaluation of what type, well, first, where are we in the change management process? Are we still building? Are we still adopting? Or are we optimizing and ready to showcase? Then based on those two categories, then you're going to get a different type of head of remote. Thank you so much for sharing that link. It's now in the in the comments. So yeah, so then you, based on those two categories, you'll say, okay, we need somebody that specializes in workplace and operations and change management, or somebody that specializes in marketing and thought leadership. And those are very different goals, or very different roles with different goals. Marketing is going to be more focused on talent acquisition and market positioning, whereas your operations and change management is going to be focused on employee retention and operational efficiency. So obviously completely different skill sets. So you need to think very, very carefully about why are we hiring a head of remote, and then that will then inform what your goals for the role are.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important distinction. Thank you for that. You also mentioned earlier this question, of course, of like measuring performance in the same way that we're not very good at archiving. Humans are actually really bad with numbers, generally speaking. And of course, there's the question of do you really measure individual productivity, or are you measuring the output of the team? What's your perspective on thinking through those KPIs that allow you to feel reassured that your team is producing what they need to?
Mm-hmm. Frankly, it doesn't necessarily what you're measuring. It matters if you're measuring it and that everybody is being measured equally. So if you are measuring one person's output and one person's charisma, that's called discrimination, and it's going to get you into a lawsuit. So what we're trying to do by moving into data in general is that we are trying to make it as equal and unbiased as possible. So if you can measure your team in a way that is unbiased and equal without data, then fantastic, do that. But for the time being, numbers are the easiest way. Now, again, those tools like ActiveTrack and Asana and Monday.com, they make those easier because they quantify, their algorithms quantify it for you. So if you're not good with numbers, then you can use a tool. However, we don't need to overcomplicate this process. You and I were talking in the green room about how I've been doing this for 15 years. This was way before cloud documents, way before project management systems, way before video calls. This was us, my team, meeting in a Starbucks every Tuesday and pulling out our to-do lists and saying, okay, well, last week you said you were going to do this, this, this. You got 4 out of the 5 things done, right? You over there got 2 out of your 5 things done. one of those people was more productive than the other. So we don't need to overcomplicate this system. It can be very manual, it can be very simple, but whatever it is, whatever system or tool we decide to use, it has to be equal.
Yeah, that's a beautiful message right there. I know that tools are never the solution to anything, but are there tools that you absolutely love that you recommend often, whether it's to help with documentation, to help with measurement, to help with that handbook that you were talking about to build it up? Just they're never the solution, but it's always good to learn about a couple more.
Yeah, so I always say that these are not necessarily personal recommendations because I don't sponsor or endorse any product. But what I will say is that there are new standards of tools that if you are a remote worker, you need to know what they are and you need to know how to use them. I referenced them a few times in the presentation, but Slack or Microsoft Teams, as a genre of product, you have to know those tools. It's no longer optional. There's not a situation in which you can be like, Slack, I've never heard of it, but give me a virtual job. Like that's not a thing anymore. So you can go on YouTube, you can go through, classes, you can create a free Slack account and just invite your friends and family to practice with you. That's fine, but you have to know those tools. Video collaboration, I would say, is absolutely on par with that. You need to be very comfortable with video platforms like Zoom. And then in addition to that, just project management systems in general. Asana is a really good one to start with. It's very easily accessible and it is very universal in a lot of its functionality. So if you know how to use Asana, it's going to be a pretty easy jump to use a lot of other project management systems. And you can get a free account. So everybody can do that easily. So that's where those are the tools that I would start with.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned project management because that's something that actually we always find is missing even in really large organizations. I'm always surprised. I'm like, surely these guys, they have it. And then it turns out that
And
they
then they
don't.
don't. Yeah.
And yeah, project management, I think, is an underlying skill. It's like writing or being good at presenting. It's an underlying skill that everybody should have always had, but is becomes even all that more important in a world where we're not always co-located, and so we can't compensate for our lack of project management through co-location. I think that's such an important point. And with that, Laurel, we're nearing the end of our chat today. I really love all of the insight and tips and just really practical, down-to-earth, pragmatic advice that you've provided us with. Thank you so much. I'm going to take us to our rapid fire round if you're ready.
I'm ready. Let's do this.
All right. So please finish these statements. Great employee experience is
Essential. It's a business strategy.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. If you're doing it to please people, don't do it. You should really know that this is good for your business and for your people.
Mm-hmm.
What is the book that every leader should read today?
Ooh, How to Win Friends and Influence People is a classic. But if everyone says that one, I would say also Start with Why by Simon Sinek.
Two very great recommendations. The ideal workplace is
Unique to each individual.
That's cool. I like that. The secret ingredient to a great employee experience is
Empathy and communication.
beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you again for joining us. I'm sorry about the technical issues, but no worries. I could hear you the entire time, so hopefully that
I'm
means
so
we have
glad.
a great recording, and we'll republish it as soon as I'm able to download it. And hopefully people will come back and ask you all their questions. I'm sure they have tons of them. Once again, thank you so much for your incredible insights. Those 15 years of building that allowed you to give us, just some really incredible places to start implementing tomorrow. And I hope that people take you up on that.
I hope so. Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. And thanks to our audience. I'm sorry that today wasn't like the best experience, but as Laurel said earlier, we are flexible. We will figure it out and we'll bring this content back to you guys. This is not lost. And you have a lot to learn by listening to this session. And as always, the conference is going on until the 21st. So if you would like to check out the rest of our lineup, it's cosmiccentersconference.com. Tomorrow we have a session with Tony Jamous. Please do join us. We'll be talking about how to use, how to leverage your purpose and your values in order to align your organization. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Laurel, thanks again for joining me today, and I'll see you around.